Hello and welcome to Chapter 16, Section 5. I'm dividing this section into two parts. This is part 1. Um, part 2 will be tomorrow. So, the way to victory for the North, spoiler alert, you guys know that the Union and the North are going to win the Civil War. And so, how does this come about? Well, in the winter of 1862 and 1863, things were not looking good for the North. But things were looking better for the South. And this is mostly due to Robert E. Lee. At the time, he was what could be determined as unbeatable. He was very strategic in his fighting. You have to remember that Robert E. Lee went to school at West Point with a lot of these generals that he was fighting against. They knew each other very well. They knew what types of things they liked to do. They knew about their strategies of war. And so he was not fighting an unfamiliar enemy, which is kind of important when you think about it. So let's talk about Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. These are two Southern victories. Robert E. Lee is going to attack Ambrose Burnside in the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. The Confederates were on a hillside, and we all know by either watching Star Wars or Fortnite that when you have the high ground, you have the advantage. And so when the Confederates were on the hillside, even though Burnside had a larger army, his repeated attacks failed, mostly because of where the Confederate army was located. So, in this Battle of Fredericksburg, thousands of Union soldiers died. Burnside was so discouraged by his loss and his failure that he resigns his position to Lincoln, and Lincoln replaces Ambrose Burnside with Joseph Hooker. Joseph Hooker takes over the Union Army, and he will spend some time trying to rebuild the army because of the devastating losses at Fredericksburg. So he is going to be given the charge to attack Lee again in 5 months. But before he could attack, Lee takes the upper hand and he attacks Joseph Hooker and his newly rebuilt army in Chancellorsville, Virginia, not far from Fredericksburg. Now, this is going to be another Confederate win, but with the good came some bad because Stonewall Jackson was accidentally killed by one of his own men, friendly fire. Actually, what happened was he accidentally got shot in the arm and it got infected, and they had to amputate his arm, and he died a week later because, Civil War medicine wasn't up to today's standards. So, a win at Chancellorsville for the Confederacy also equaled a loss of Stonewall Jackson, a very important leader. So, at this point, Robert E. Lee starts really pushing it. He decides that he is going to try and penetrate the North as far as they had gone. So he thinks that if he can defeat the North in Northern Territory, that possibly Great Britain and France might join the Confederacy. Now, this is what you call a pipe dream. It's empty, like a pipe, because this is never going to happen. They just keep thinking that it will. So Lee heads north, like I said, in hopes of Great Britain and France joining the Southern war effort. And he's going to take 75,000 troops and he's going to head toward Pennsylvania. Now, again, this is as far north as the Confederate Army has ever been, and actually it's as far north as they'll ever go, because this is going to lead us to the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Joseph Hooker was told by Lincoln, you need to follow Lee and attack him, and he did not want to do that. In fact, very few generals wanted to take on Lee at this point. He wanted to go and attack Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, not follow Lee into Pennsylvania. And so when Hooker doesn't do that, Lincoln replaces him with General George Meade, another Union general replacement for the Army of the Potomac. So George Meade obviously is going to do what Lincoln wants him to do. His mission is only one: find and attack Robert E. Lee. Now, George Meade is going to get lucky. He's going to accidentally, some of his army is going to run into Lee's soldiers in a town just outside of Gettysburg. The By 1863, the supplies for the Confederacy were running very low, and so you had a lot of the soldiers in rags. Their uniforms were rags. A lot of them didn't have shoes. And so Lee's men were actually raiding the town for shoes. They were looking for shoes. And so Meade's army accidentally runs into some of these. And so this leads to the Battle of Gettysburg, which takes place or starts on July 1st, 1863. And it lasts for 3 days. So it's kind of like a back and forth. Now, the North, they're going to be outnumbered on day one. And so they kind of take their army and they flee to a location called Cemetery Ridge. Now, that right there tells you something. A ridge is usually up higher. So the next day, day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg, is a day that the Union counterattacks the Confederate army from the ridge. Again, if you have the high ground, you have the advantage. And so that leads to day 3. The Union army is on this ridge. The Confederate army knows they need to try and get them off the ridge if they are to win. So on this final third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, there is one final attack that is called Pickett's Charge. It is led by George Pickett, and he basically takes 14,000 Confederate troops up a hill to attack the Union troops. And they're easy targets for the Union, and only about, of the 14,000, only about 100 soldiers made it across the ridge. Now, those are really bad odds. So this final battle, this final attempt called Pickett's Charge ends the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this is a Union victory, but it was devastating. Now, you have between 46,000 and 51,000 casualties. Now, that's a lot over 3 days. And so, again, the final attack was called Pickett's Charge. And it was disastrous for the Confederacy, and this leads to a Union victory. So the Confederacy will never go this far north again. This kind of is going to start turning the tide of the war. The Battle of Gettysburg, along with the Battle of Vicksburg. Now, at the very same time that Gettysburg was taking place in Pennsylvania, the Battle of Vicksburg in Mississippi was happening. And this was being led by Ulysses S. Grant. He led the attack for the North, and the South surrenders the port of Vicksburg. It was on the Mississippi. And after the Battle of Vicksburg, the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River, which was exactly one of their goals, because by controlling the entire Mississippi River, that western part of the Confederacy is completely cut off from the rest. And so Gettysburg, along with Vicksburg, marks the turning point of the Civil War in favor of the Union. Now, 5 months later, the location where the Battle of Gettysburg happened was going to be dedicated to as a cemetery. And so it was a big event, and this is the Gettysburg Address. And so on November 19th, 1863, there was, it was like a lot of special, invitation. A lot of like important people were there, including the president and senators and, the families of soldiers who were killed at Gettysburg. And so it was a big event. And Edward Everett was the main event. Edward Everett was probably the most famous orator, which means speech giver, in the country at that time. And he spoke for 2 hours. That's right. He spoke for 2 hours discussing the Battle of Gettysburg, recounting the events of the 3 days. And so right after that, Lincoln gets up and he gives what is probably the most famous speech in American history, the Gettysburg Address. Now, his speech only lasted 2 to 3 minutes. I mean, it's 271 words in the Gettysburg Address compared to 13,000 words in Edward Everett's speech. This is an important moment, and I'm actually going to just give you a few words of the Gettysburg Address while you're listening here. Lincoln says, "It is for us the living to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." See you tomorrow.